The ugly guy next to the relay.
Okay.
Vai ser mais próximo.
Mas vocês estão longe. Vamos lá, fazer a pergunta.
Could you tell us a little about your career in clinical engineering, please?
Well, I've been in the clinical engineering area for almost 50 years, and got into it by working in the Veterans Affairs hospital system in the U.S. and initially was working in research instrumentation, and in 1969 the VA was invited to a program where they were trying to get engineers and physicians together to talk about the problems of instrumentation, because at that time physicians were developing instrumentation, engineers were developing instrumentations, and nobody was talking to each other. So they asked us to look at what we were doing maintenance-wise. So I got to checking and found out that the VA was not doing anything with maintenance of medical equipment. And over the next couple of 3 years, I ended up helping develop the clinical engineering or biomedical engineering program for the VA, for which then they said, oh, you can come to Washington, D.C. and head up the program. I told them, no, I don't want to come to Washington, D.C. I live in Arkansas, which is in the central part of the United States. And so I ended up developing a training program for the VA for clinical engineering, initially training technicians. And of course, at that point in time, this was about the same time that AAMI started. And in a few years, I got to looking at training of technicians, and they decided, there was not any real continuity in programs training technicians in the U.S. So they developed a certification program, which I was on the initial board for developing a certification program for technicians. And then out of that, a few years later, they looked at developing certification for clinical engineers, and I became certified in the first group of clinical engineers. Even though I'm not a clinical engineer, I'm a chemist by training, but I had worked in instrumentation, so that's how I got into the clinical engineering area. And then over the years, as training with the VA, then I trained clinical engineers, then I trained hospital engineers, then I trained hospital safety people. So for about 35 to 40 years, that's what I did. I trained. At the same time, during that period of time, I became a department chairman at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences to train technicians, and I did that for 25 years as well, training probably 10 or so technicians a year. And then at the same time, I also developed my own company, which we developed correspondence courses and did workshops and such in the areas of hospital engineering and biomedical engineering. So I spent a lot of time doing those kind of activities, and at the same time getting involved in international activities as well as activities in the U.S. Worked on the initial clinical engineering workshops that were done. Did one here in Brazil in the early 90s, I think, and did various ones around the world for several years. And so that's how I got into the field.
And what was the most, in your opinion, the most important moment in your career that you remember with big love?
Well, I guess, probably the most important thing was in coming to work for the VA. I ended up getting into instrumentation by research instrumentation, and another activity I did was I developed a way to move research equipment around the VA hospital system so it wasn't being used in one place, it could be used someplace else. And so this kind of got me more involved in a national level in the VA, and that's probably the most significant thing from that standpoint.
Yeah. And could you give an advice for the youngest who want to be clinical engineer?
Well, I think that's a problem I looked at right now, and I think I'm concerned about younger people coming into the field and staying in the field. In general, I think it's particularly to be active. I find that most younger people want to do short-term projects. They don't want to be involved in something long-term. I'm not sure exactly how to get people involved in something long-term. Are you interested in being long-term?
I'm working almost 10 years.
Yeah, that's good. And I think the thing is, I think people need to see that they're accomplishing something. And I think as the field is changing, well, everybody says it's changing totally. I don't totally believe that. The basics still have to be done. I mean, my view of clinical engineering is very broad. I think it involves, as you've seen some presentations here, it involves looking at medicine. I probably have one of the most technical pieces of medical equipment on me right now. I have a hearing aid, and it has a computer base in it that is really pretty sophisticated. However, it also has a maintenance problem sometimes. The little wire that works with it gets loose, and I have to be sure it's tight. But again, the simple things that have to still be done. So I think the thing is, as we look at, you need to keep in touch with the whole field. I think also you need to be in touch with the medical staff. It's very critical that as a clinical engineer, particularly I've seen things, if you're looking at procurement for anything in the hospital, there needs to be a committee that involves the clinical engineer, the doctors and nurses, and the facility engineer, hospital engineer, to look at the whole picture and be sure that everything, number one, do you really need it, kind of thing. I mean, sometimes instead of maybe medical equipment, it could be that there is a medical procedure or a drug that is actually better for what needs to be done. And the clinical engineer needs to, I mean, you need to be an expert in that, but you need to be able to discuss things with people like that. And then you need to be able to, from the hospital standpoint, that whenever you have something, particularly a major piece of equipment coming in, it doesn't sit in a box, as I've seen pictures here. It needs to be, everything is ready to go. And so there the hospital engineers you need to work with them. In fact, I can see a clinical engineer being in charge of a project with the hospital engineer to develop the installation of a major piece of equipment. And so, I think can be a very broad field.
Would you like to agree your interview, your patients with us? Your patients with us. We would like to agree your contribution for the clinical engineering career.
Well, I've written a lot over the years. I've done a lot of teaching. Hopefully, I have helped some people come into the field. Well, in fact, I know a couple of people I have. I even helped do some training with people like Tom Judd and Yadin and such as that. I've been around longer than they have. But realistically, I think I see some people that have been in workshops with us over the years that have really done great. And I think that's the kind of thing I see is, maybe I've helped them along, and I hope kind of thing. And I've trained a lot of technicians. And it's always helpful, I think, whenever I meet somebody and they say, I was in a workshop with you 10 years ago, kind of thing. And if they remember that, hopefully I said something worthwhile.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very good.